Welcome to the Lion's Share podcast, where we break down today's most impactful research and bring fresh insights from the academic frontier straight to you.
So, what if I told you that the sheer brilliance of a startup's core idea has, almost zero statistical impact on its long-term survival?
I mean, it sounds completely backwards, right?
Right. But we're looking at this massive data set today, and it suggests that something completely out of your control, like the macroeconomic timing of your launch, dictates a staggering 42% of your success.
Which just completely detonates that whole mythological narrative we usually hear.
Yeah, exactly.
We're just so culturally conditioned to picture, the lone genius in a garage sketching out some billion-dollar paradigm shift on a napkin.
Classic Silicon Valley folklore.
Exactly. And we expect the market to just naturally beat a path to their door. But when you actually look at the empirical reality of venture creation, that romanticized origin story just falls apart almost immediately.
Which is exactly why we are unpacking this today. For you listening right now, whether you're deep into a DBA dissertation on entrepreneurial orientation, or trying to engineer a corporate innovation unit, or even just prepping a pitch, imagine you and I are just walking across a university campus together, sorting through this mountain of diagnostic evidence.
Yeah, just thinking aloud about what actually works.
Right, because our mission for this deep dive is to cut through that folklore and isolate the actual mechanical success factors for business modeling and entrepreneurship.
And we really have incredible source material to anchor this conversation.
We do.
We're leaning heavily on the Conversely project. That's the comprehensive Australian study of entrepreneurial emergence.
Huge study.
Massive. And we're layering that with Bill Gross's rigorous analysis of startup incubators, alongside some really hard-hitting data from Harvard Business Review and Boston Consulting Group.
Focusing on how those massive legacy corporations try to manufacture agility, right?
Exactly. The big dreadnoughts trying to act like speedboats.
Well, before we get to the corporate dreadnoughts, let's start with those speedboats. What makes the Conversely study so uniquely valuable to a scholar practitioner audience is its methodology.
Oh, the methodology is everything here.
Right. Because they didn't just interview successful founders 5 years after their IPO.
Because we all know that leads to massive hindsight bias.
Exactly. Retrospective entrepreneurship studies are basically like asking lottery winners for investment advice.
That is a perfect way to put it.
They always remember their journey as this straight line of brilliant, rational decisions, and they completely ignore the sheer luck or the near-fatal missteps.
Yeah, hindsight bias is just the absolute plague of business research. But the researchers behind Conversely bypassed that entirely.
How did they do it?
They used a longitudinal, real-time method. They tracked random samples of 625 nascent firms, meaning pre-operational, literally just ideas being workshopped.
Wow, so really just at the ground floor.
Exactly. And another 559 young firms that had been operating for under 4 years. And they tracked them over 4 annual waves.
So they were watching the ship being built in real time.
Yes, observing the venture characteristics, the resources they acquired, the processes, the environmental friction, all of it as it happened.
Which brings me back to that shocking 42% statistic I mentioned at the start.
Ah, the Bill Gross data.
Yeah. In his TED analysis, he looked at 200 companies, half from his own incubator, Idea Lab, and half outside. And he was desperately trying to prove that the aha moment, the foundational idea, was the prime mover of success.
He really wanted the idea to win.
He did, but the data forced him to reconsider. Timing beat out the team, the business model, the funding, and, the idea itself.
The contrast he provides in that data is just mind-blowing.
Like the Airbnb example.
Exactly. Airbnb was famously rejected by top-tier venture capitalists because, the core idea sounded terrible on paper.
I mean, who in their right mind wants to rent an air mattress in a stranger's living room?
Right. But they launched right in the teeth of the 2008 recession. The macroeconomic timing provided this massive external pressure.
People desperately needed extra income to pay their mortgages.
Exactly. And that financial desperation completely overrode the psychological friction of letting strangers into their homes.
So the timing literally manufactured the market readiness.
It did. Now look at the flip side of that coin. Gross funded an early online entertainment company called Z.com back in 1999.
Oh, wow. 1999.
Yeah. It had everything you could possibly want in a venture. Incredible funding, a stellar business model, elite Hollywood talent on the roster.
But the timing was off.
Way off. Broadband penetration in the U.S. was still too low. Users had to download incredibly clunky browser codecs just to watch a grainy, buffering video.
Ugh, I remember those days.
Right, the friction was just too high, and they went out of business in 2003. But then, just 2 years later, Adobe Flash solves the browser codec issue.
Oh, wow.
And broadband crosses that critical 50% household penetration mark, and boom, YouTube launches.
And YouTube didn't even have a coherent business model when they launched.
No.
They just had a search bar and a video player. But the timing was flawless.
Flawless.
I'm struggling to reconcile this, though. Like, if timing is 42% of the battle, and macroeconomic shifts are largely out of a founder's control, are we just throwing darts blindfolded here?
It feels like that, doesn't it?
Yeah. How does a startup or a corporate team actually measure or manufacture readiness without just relying on blind luck?
Well, they manufacture readiness through a sheer volume of interaction with the market. And this is where the CAUSE data is incredibly revealing.
Okay, unpack that for me.
For those nascent pre-operational firms, the single strongest predictor of eventually reaching operational status wasn't the novelty of the idea. It was the absolute volume of actions completed by the founding team.
So just relentless execution,
Yeah.
like registering the domain, calling suppliers, building wireframes.
Interviewing 50 potential users. Yes, exactly. Action creates a forced feedback loop with the environment.
You can't just sit in a room and theorize.
Right. You cannot gauge if the timing is right by theorizing. Every action you take acts like a sonar ping against the market.
A sonar ping. I like that.
Yeah, like if you put up a landing page and get 0 clicks, the market is telling you the timing is wrong or the framing is wrong. The firms that survived were the ones pinging the environment constantly, sensing the currents, and adjusting their position based on what came back.
That perfectly bridges into the concept of business model experimentation and how we actually design these ventures.
Of the business plan debate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the CAUSE study looked deeply at the infamous formal business plan. We've all been forced to write them, right?
Those dense 50-page theoretical documents.
Exactly. The ones that are functionally obsolete the second you hit print.
Right. Well, the study actually validates a lot of the modern skepticism around business plans, but it introduces a really fascinating nuance.
Which is?
Having a finished business plan sitting in a drawer did absolutely nothing to guarantee success. Its mere existence was statistically irrelevant.
Unsurprising.
But the act of continually revising and formalizing that plan strongly correlated with a firm's ability to survive and hire employees.
Oh, that's interesting. So it shifts the business plan from being this static blueprint to a dynamic thinking tool.
Exactly. You aren't blindly following the map. You are constantly redrawing the map based on those sonar pings you're getting from your actions.
It's the cognitive process of planning, not the artifact of the plan itself, that generates value.
Spot on. When you revise the plan, you are actively digesting market feedback and reshaping the opportunity.
But shaping that opportunity is incredibly delicate, right?
Yeah.
The CAUSE data mapped out what happens when ventures pivot.
Yeah, and the pivot data is brutal.
It is. If a startup changes its promotion or its selling method, its chances of survival actually improve. But if they change their core market or their target customer, their probability of success just falls off a cliff.
It's devastating.
Why is changing the customer so deadly? Shouldn't a nimble startup be able to just pivot to whoever has the money?
You'd think so, but think about the invisible architecture of a business. When you change your target customer, you aren't just changing a demographic on a slide deck. You are essentially incinerating all of the domain expertise, the relational capital, and the deep psychological insights you've gathered about that specific group's pain points. You are resetting to 0.
Oh, wow. You're throwing out the foundation.
Yes. But if you keep the target customer constant, if you stay obsessively focused on their specific problem and merely tweak the delivery mechanism or the promotional channel,
Then you are iterating on top of a solid foundation.
exactly. It completely reinforces that old adage. Fall in love with the customer's problem, not your specific solution.
Okay, so that's the speedboat navigating the chaotic ocean. But what happens when you're already a massive, heavily armored dreadnought?
The corporate side.
Yeah, let's shift to corporate venturing and entrepreneurship. If timing and iterative action are so critical for a nimble startup, how on earth does a slow, bureaucratic Fortune 500 company replicate that agility without just crushing it?
Well, they rarely do, honestly, because they're fundamentally fighting their own biology.
Their biology.
Yeah, the literature refers to this as the corporate killing instinct.
That sounds intense.
It is. To understand this, we have to look at the concept of the ambidextrous organization.
Okay.
A massive, mature corporation is a highly optimized machine. It's designed to exploit an existing, profitable core business. Their processes, their incentive structures, their quarterly earnings targets, they are all built around reducing variance and maximizing efficiency.
I like to think of those efficiency metrics as the corporate immune system.
Yeah.
Like the CFO and the frontline business unit managers are the white blood cells.
That's a great analogy.
Their entire job is to seek out and destroy variance.
Yeah.
And what is a radical new innovation? It is pure, unfiltered variance.
It's a foreign body.
Exactly.
And that organ rejection analogy is spot on. The core business naturally attacks the new venture because the new venture threatens the status quo.
Do we have a concrete example of this?
Oh, definitely. Look at the historical example of Ciba-Geigy, a massive chemical conglomerate.
Okay.
Their internal R&D actually engineered these highly effective, disease-resistant seeds. It was a brilliant, world-changing innovation.
Sounds like a huge win.
You'd think, but the frontline business units aggressively mobilized to kill the project.
Wait, really? Why?
Because disease-resistant seeds would completely cannibalize their own highly profitable pesticide and fungicide divisions.
Oh. Wow. So the immune system attacked the innovation to protect the cash cow.
Precisely. So how does a massive company survive its own immune system?
Right. If we look at the Harvard Business Review research by Di Fiore, the antidote is the chief innovation officer, or someone with equivalent executive authority.
Yes. The CIO acts as the corporate immunosuppressant.
I love that.
The HBR piece contrasts different approaches to this role, specifically looking at Procter & Gamble versus Samsung.
How do they differ?
Well, Samsung's VIP Center operated more like an elite internal facilitation hub. They were deeply focused on training and supporting existing business units to innovate incrementally.
Okay, so working within the system.
Yeah,
But Procter & Gamble's corporate growth factory took a much more aggressive stance. Right.
very much so. They were heavily invested in directing seed funding and, crucially, designing structural shelter for radical projects.
I really want to unpack that term, designing shelter.
Mm.
How does an executive practically shield a fragile new idea from the wrath of a mature accounting department?
It requires creating an entirely separate organizational home with protected, dedicated funding for what we call homeless ideas.
Homeless ideas.
Yeah, these are innovations that either carry way too much risk for the traditional business units or they bleed across the boundaries of existing departments, so nobody wants to take ownership of them.
Xerox is a great historical case study here. They recognized their own killing instinct, so they created a new enterprise board that functioned almost exactly like an external venture capital firm, but entirely within the company.
Yes. And Thermoelectron employed a different but equally fascinating shelter mechanism.
What do they do?
They would literally spin out the new idea into a completely separate legal entity, but retain a 51% majority stake.
That's brilliant. By pushing it out of the house, the new venture doesn't have to carry the massive administrative overhead of the parent company.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to justify its existence on a quarterly earnings call optimized for a mature manufacturing process. It can act like a speedboat, but with the Dreadnought's fuel lines still attached.
And the Boston Consulting Group's best practices data completely validates this structural necessity. Over 90% of self-reported strong innovators explicitly cite visible, aggressive top management commitment as the primary driver of their success.
Because if the CEO and the CIO aren't constantly guarding that structural shelter,
the frontline managers will inevitably tear it down to hit their quarterly KPIs.
right. There's another piece of BCG and PwC data that caught my eye regarding how these corporate units actually interact with the market.
Oh, the customer insights data.
Yeah. They found that companies capturing insights directly from customers, like in the trenches, unfiltered experience 3 times the growth in operating income compared to peers who rely on indirect secondary market research.
It circles right back to the Kazi finding about action. Buying a 50-page market research report from a consulting firm is not an action that generates a feedback loop.
No, it's just an illusion of progress.
Exactly. You only manufacture readiness by pinging the market directly.
You know, I want to pivot us into the critique phase of our deep dive, because as we synthesize all this data, a few major tensions emerge.
Tensions between theory and the data.
Yeah. For our listeners who are steeped in modern entrepreneurship theory, The Kazi data actually throws a massive heavy wrench into some of the most sacred Silicon Valley dogmas.
The most glaring contradiction is how the data challenges the absolute worship of the lean startup methodology.
Right. The classic debate between effectual and causal logic. Modern startup culture treats effectuation as the ultimate virtue, iterating with exactly what is at hand, making decisions based on affordable loss, and aggressively pivoting.
It also idolizes bricolage.
Right, which is the academic term for extreme frugality, bootstrapping, trying to build an empire using nothing but the founding team's sweat equity.
Well, the Kazi researchers actually found the exact opposite to be true for long-term venture survival.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Firms that employed a highly causal decision-making strategy, meaning they were highly goal-directed, operated with a pre-planned vision, and targeted specific outcomes, were statistically much more likely to survive, reach operational status, and earn a profit than those relying purely on effectuation.
I find that deeply counterintuitive. Are we saying the lean startup model of building the plane on the way down is fundamentally flawed?
Not flawed, but perhaps over-applied. I mean, agility is a requirement, but you cannot simply pivot your way into a cohesive, enduring vision.
You still need a target.
You still need a defined target to provide an architecture for your actions. Furthermore, the Kazi data revealed that extreme bricolage actually crippled a firm's ability to create employment.
Oh, it's the trap of the solopreneur mindset. If you refuse to hire outside help, if you refuse to raise the necessary capital because you are so fiercely protective of your equity and want to bootstrap everything yourself, you inevitably starve the venture of the resources it needs to scale.
Right. You might survive, but you remain a lifestyle business, not a high-growth venture.
You cannot build a massive enterprise if you stubbornly refuse to hire a crew. It requires capital and moving beyond the resources you merely have at hand.
Let's look at another massive tension. The novelty paradox.
Ah, yes. We are culturally obsessed with the idea of the category creator. Everyone wants to be the next Steve Jobs, inventing a product so wildly novel that it spawns an entirely new market out of thin air.
But again, the data punishes that ambition. The Kazi study highlights that pursuing a highly novel business idea, specifically one that attempts to create an entirely new market, drastically decreases the statistical likelihood of survival.
Why is that?
Because educating a new market is obscenely expensive. You are fighting a two-front war. You have to convince the consumer that they even have a problem in the first place, and then convince them that your unproven product is the solution.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Most startups simply bleed out financially before the market reaches the necessary cognitive adoption.
But the paradox in the data is that while market novelty is a death sentence, developing highly novel, proprietary technology drastically improves survivability.
Yes, that's the nuance.
So how do we synthesize those two conflicting realities?
It points to a very specific optimized venture design. The ideal positioning is not to create a new market. The ideal positioning is to find an existing, deep, familiar market with a well-understood pain point and deploy a highly protected, proprietary technological solution into it.
So instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince the general public they need a flying hovercraft, which is a new market, you build a vastly superior, heavily patented internal combustion engine for existing commercial boats. You take the defense mechanism of intellectual property, but you avoid the agonizing friction of market education.
Exactly. You want the IP moat, but you want to sell to a customer who already knows exactly what they're buying.
Okay, there's one final quirk in the data that I found genuinely alarming,
Yeah.
and it relates to social capital. We constantly hear the networking cliche, your network is your net worth.
Right.
And, broadly speaking, the Kazi data confirms that having a strong professional reputation is a massive asset.
But the alarming caveat involves where you source your early customers.
This blew my mind.
The data shows that accessing customer contacts primarily through a founder's personal, informal social network actually decreases the venture's chances of survival.
Why would relying on your personal network for early traction hurt you? It seems like the most logical place to start getting those initial sonar pings we talk about.
Because the pings come back corrupted.
Bad.
Yeah, it's the mechanism of the false positive. When your uncle or your college roommate buys your early-stage software, they aren't engaging in a rational economic transaction.
They're buying it out of social loyalty.
Exactly. They're buying you.
They don't want to hurt your feelings. They don't give you the brutal, unvarnished reality check that a cold market provides.
And that is fatal. It creates a complete illusion of product-market fit. The founder scales up operations, assumes the business model is validated, and the moment they try to sell to cold traffic strangers who have zero social obligation to them, the conversion rate drops to zero and the company collapses.
The loyalty masks the fatal flaws in the product. That is a terrifying blind spot for any early-stage founder.
It is. The friction of selling to strangers is the exact friction that forces you to refine the product until it actually solves a problem.
So if taking all of this back to my desk on Monday morning, how does this fundamentally shift our approach? If we strip away the mythology, what are the empirical realities?
Well, if you are an entrepreneur or an early-stage founder, the mandate is clear. You have to aggressively orient around timing and market readiness. Are consumers macroeconomically primed for what you're offering?
And you measure that readiness not by theorizing, but through relentless, tangible actions that ping the market.
Right. And write the business plan, but treat it as a living, breathing, cognitive tool. Don't be afraid of causal planning, and don't let the romance of bootstrapping choke out your ability to scale.
Find that middle ground. Build deep proprietary tech, but aim it squarely at a market that already exists.
Exactly. Now, for our listeners operating inside massive corporations, the directive is structural. You cannot simply command a frontline business unit to innovate.
You have to acknowledge the corporate immune system.
You do. You need an empowered chief innovation officer to design robust, protected shelters for those fragile, high-variance ideas, shielding them from the brutal efficiency metrics of the core business.
Because without that active executive protection, the organization will inevitably cannibalize its own future to protect its present. It's fascinating how these realities cut right through the lore of the lone visionary. The flawless idea is a wonderful plot for a movie, but in the trenches, it's action, timing, and structural shelter that dictate survival.
Which is ultimately an empowering realization, I think. It means success isn't restricted to a handful of divinely inspired geniuses. It is a mechanical process that can be studied, designed, and executed.
I love that. And, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final lingering thought to chew on. We started by looking at Bill Gross's data, revealing that macroeconomic timing accounts for 42% of a venture's success.
Yeah.
If almost half the battle is determined by massive technological and economic forces completely outside of a founder's control, are the most celebrated entrepreneurs in our history truly the architects of their own empires? Or are they simply the world's greatest surfers? Visionaries who didn't actually create the wave, but were uniquely positioned, heavily practiced, and bold enough to paddle out and ride it when it finally arrived. Something to consider the next time you're out there trying to read the currents.
Thanks for tuning into the Lion's Share podcast. If you enjoyed today's discussion, share it with a friend and join us next time for more ideas worth talking about. We'll see you next time.